Ready? Representative Henderson.
Here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Sherwood. Representative Stith.
Here.
Representative Walters. Representative Swanitzer.
Here.
Chairman Nicholas.
Facility up in Canada. It is creating a special district in certain parts of the state for industrial development, where you kind of work in tandem and you have some type of a core facility or two, and then all of the components or byproducts of there, you work around them to for further development. Just typically it's a tax-free zone of some sort, and it's just a mechanism to launch new businesses or expand current businesses in Wyoming. And this first came out about 2014. We flew up to Heartland with the governor, toured these facilities. A draft bill like this was drafted in 2016 and didn't really go anywhere. So this is a resurrection of that bill. And so I don't know that the budget is accurate. I mean, he's got 3.2 million in here. But I'm tempted to let it sink or swim on its own and not have us cherry pick out the problems with it. That's my inclination.
I agree, Mr. Chairman. I think it fits into the conversation we're having. I looked at the bill and there's components in there that we have that were relevant in 16 that are less relevant today.
Yeah.
And, we got all the different task force that can maybe be consolidated to some degree. And I think let the floor.
And it's a re-referral. I actually had a budget bill from this bill, and it turned it out. I winged it down to about 10 pages and did just what you said, kind of a more direct towards. And so I might get together with a good bringer and work through my draft and tailor this for amendments. But unfortunately, I don't have time to do that right now. Okay. Go ahead.
New spending.
Yeah.
3.2 of it comes from last year's budget.
Yeah, and from what we've given to the governor.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Any public comment? Any public comment? Okay, we have a motion.
Move the bill. Second.
Move for due pass by Representative Stith, seconded by Representative Walters. Roll call.
Representative Henderson. Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood.
Aye.
Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Walters.
Aye.
Representative Swanitzer.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
All right. Okay, next. Patrick, come on up. Patrick, your biggest chore is going to be explain this when it gets, if and when it gets out of the house over on the other side of the body. But we continue to need education and to be able to articulate it half as well as you do. So I want you to take your time and walk through in our explanations again, because you need to brainwash us on how all this works.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick Fleming, CIO for the Treasurer's Office. So with House Bill 89, the focus of what we are trying to do in the big picture is increase income and reduce the complexities that we face for managing money for the state.
Say that again, please.
Increase the returns to the state while reducing the complexities. So first I'll start off on the complexities. We have 15 funds that we manage. The vast majority of other asset managers, state funds, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, go down the list, have one fund. And all of the other funds are within that umbrella. But the legislature has deemed it appropriate that every fund that we get, not every fund, the vast majority of the funds have its own asset allocation. That causes investment complexities and operational complexities, as you're all aware of from some of the things that we face. Now on the investment side, the big difference that we have.
So before you go on,
Okay.
give us examples,
Each one of those funds,
which are,
of the 15 funds that we have, so we have the Common School, Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, University Permanent Land Fund, Permanent Land Fund, Higher Education, Hathaway, Workers' Compensation, LISRA, SAP, WildStar 123, Tomorrow Fund. How did I do so far on that? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, so Patrick, do you feel that we've done that just, I mean, is that just reflective of just kind of a traditional,
yeah, it's the layman's creation.
it's
of
a
it.
layman's, creation, and so we're gonna make it and it's sacred and it's precious and and we just have not contemplated that it can remain sacred and precious, but can be mingled with others. I mean, if you give any, you have any comments on how this come about to be so many?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson. So like all of the funds, any of your constituents and people that you've talked at, and we've talked, separately on many of these different funds, they have their own special needs and wants. And they'll say, okay, well, we need to have liquidity for a certain amount, but then also we want a certain rate of return. LISRA. Okay, so the LISRA, rainy day fund. So we have to have a small, short-term, 500 million mandatory for Cat 5 periods. But then we want something a little bit more liquid, but still higher yielding. So we have what is called the core fixed income allocation. Now we want capital appreciation. So the last third of it is invested in all across of our asset classes, like a PMTF allocation. That would be one. Workers' compensation, same situation. It has a long duration asset. You cannot have short duration securities versus long duration. Then the most interesting ones would be Common School. So Common School with a 5% mandatory spend, the IFC, State Loan Investment Board, looks at it and said, okay, with this asset allocation, the number one priority is not total rate of return. It is income focused. So when you look at it, they say, okay, we have to have a 5% spend. So I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
I said, bless you. To
Oh, I'm sorry. So if we have to have a 5% spend, then we have to have an allocation that would have more income to support it. So that leads us to kind of the biggest picture is our definition of income constitutionally. And that's really the root of all problems here, is that our definition of income is interest income, dividends, and realized capital gains. Interest income, dividends, and realized capital gains. Where other pensions, endowments, Wyoming retirement system that everyone's familiar with, they don't care about where the income comes from to make that, let's call 5 or 7% spend. All they have to do is fulfill
It's
that.
called what?
They don't care where that income comes from. The funds are not inviolate. All they care about is the income. So
So the way you explained it, I think I misunderstood. I want to make sure I don't screw this up. You say, when you said we have income, and then you said interest, dividends, and realized capital gains, I took that as income, but that is not income under our current definition.
The constitutional definition of our income is interest income, which would come from the bonds that we buy, from any of our short-term deposits, CDs, any of those things that would fall under the interest income. And those are very well spelled out. We get those every quarter, every month, or every 6 months, every year, depending on the coupon payment. Dividends come from our stocks. So many of the stocks pay a dividend, and that's where we get income from the stocks. And then realized capital gains, which we have no idea. But when either our internal management or our managers buy and sell securities, there typically is a realized capital gain or loss, depending on what they have. So the big missing factor that we're not including in income is unrealized capital gains. So let's just use an example for all of you in your investment income. Let's say you had $100 in your investment fund and you had a great year and that fund doubled and is $200 now. But you can't spend the 100. You want to keep that. You're saying, no, I don't want to spend the 100. But I have $100 now that I can spend. I can take my wife out to dinner. I can do whatever. But if that 200 was only comprised of, let's say, dividends, you might only have $1 of that 200 that you could spend. So our definition is we're saying, oh, we have $200. And most people look at it and go, no, I have $200. I can spend whatever I want, up to 100 if I'm going to save it, the inviolate nature. No, you cannot. So even with a 5% return, we could have theoretically 100% return in the fund and still not meet our spending policy because of our definition of income. And that's where the constitutional amendment that we've talked about, if you could do that, then you would have the ability to just spend what you're making as long as those funds remained inviolate and you have the reserve accounts and so forth. So that is the big problem that we face. But because constitutional amendment would take years, probably July of 25 would be the earliest we could implement
The
that.
question is, to me, though, if we pass that constitutional amendment and you can use unrealized gains, how do you take advantage of it, number one, and how do we still protect the corpus?
Mr. Chairman, so in that instance, let's just use that $100 to keep it simple. As long as the beginning of the year, July 1, we say, okay, this fund is worth $100. You cannot, that is inviolate. You cannot spend below that. And anything on top of that then could be used to fulfill the spending requirements. So it would give you this runway that you would know how much money that you would be able to spend over this period. So it is just purely an accounting part of actually knowing what the difference would be. In other states, New Mexico, Utah, Idaho, these other states, that's what they do. They've gone through and they've done the constitutional amendment to be able to have this flexibility. So once you then have that total, the difference between cost basis, which is your 100, market value, which in this example was 200, as long as you have that difference between market value and cost value, it's positive, then you could fulfill that spending. Now let's see what happens in a really bad time in years and years of a bear market, 1929 or whatever. So all of a sudden now the market value drops below the cost basis. So you're now under $100. You could, then it would have to revert back to interest income, dividends, and realized capital gains. But then we have the reserve accounts to fulfill, to hopefully make up for that 5%, to make that 5% spend. So that is how you would fulfill it.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
Mr. Fleming, so would you contemplate that in the event that you've got a market value of 200, so you start spending it, so you spend 50 just to make it simple, but then the market turns bad suddenly so that now your cost base, your market value is now 95 and your cost basis is 100. Is it contemplated that you would then use the reserve accounts to backfill the permanent fund to bring it back up to 100, or do you just let it sort of sit at 95 for a while?
In that instance, under the Meyer rule, which states that you cannot distribute the realized capital gain until you fulfill that base market value. So until we had realized capital gains or other earnings that would bring you back up to that 100, you would not be able to do anything with that. The reserve accounts would then just be purely for what they would be intended to do, would be making up any shortfall difference between the spending policy and the
So
earnings.
we have we have drafted two bills that are constitutional amendments that do this. And in those draft bills, I think it creates a time frame in which to pay it back so that you don't have to do it all at once. But you can use the reserve accounts and you can do it over 3 years, I think is the number.
So that was kind of a segue into the 89, what we're trying to talk about on the reserve accounts. So right now, let's use common school again, because that's the easiest one, which has an income focus in the return, in the asset allocation profile, meaning the stocks, bonds, equities, private equity, all of the different things that we invest in. Every year when we do our asset allocation meeting, we have a different asset allocation for common school because we need that current definition of income. Because of that, it has a lower return historically than the permanent mineral trust fund. So in the presentation that I presented last time, I just took the last 5 years. You can take any time frame that you want. But historically, a total rate of return strategy, meaning the highest type of return that you're trying to achieve, will be higher than a fixed income or income focused, because those are typically more secure, less volatile, whatever, and it has a lower rate of return. But anyway, that difference between the two was approximately 313 million, meaning common school underperformed PMTF over the last 5 years to the tune of 313 million. So that decision cost the state that amount of money. Would it be the same in the future? Absolutely not. It will be something different. So some people would say, well, why not take 10 years? I'm like, well, I got the numbers. We can do 10, we could do 15, whatever you want to do. But the bottom line on it is that a diversified, well-diversified total rate of return strategy historically has a higher return than a fixed income, heavy income focused return. So what we're saying in this bill is if we change that allocation, we could get more money for the various funds. Now that's the first part. Before I move on, the second part is, where are these reserve accounts housed? So because they're only about 1.5 times spend, meaning that we have, if we had no income, which isn't the case, but just assume we didn't, we could have 1.5 years of less than 5% before these reserve accounts are depleted. So in that instance, we have to have those reserve accounts in a very safe investment. So they're housed in what's called the state agency pool, which is basically your checking accounts for the state, for all the agencies. If we had a larger reserve account, we could then move those also into a higher returning fund. And if you take the PMTF and common school on that, it was another, approximately 170 million, let's say, over the last 5 years that we would add. So those are the two parts of when we're saying get a higher return that we could potentially achieve. Yes, sir.
Patrick, this is like the umpteenth time I've heard this, and I think I'm getting a little better, but bless your heart, you've been very patient with us. But one of the things that I keep contemplating or think I hear is what you just said is we have these reserve accounts throughout our government, for as we establish these. Again, rather than leaving them as individual reserve accounts, you would combine them, because the need on any one, the call on all of them at once just isn't going to happen. The call would probably come on one or the other, but housed all together, they still exist, but you'd have the potential of investing them for a greater return because the call on them wouldn't be as great. There'd be some synergy there that allows for a better investment. Am I saying that right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, first of all, don't apologize. This is extremely complicated. This is very hard to, just the spending policies alone and going through this. This is not simple. So I'll try to go through this, but what we're trying to do when you're looking at it, there's so many moving parts. Again, the complexity of the 15 funds and everything, it's not easy. So we have 4 main reserve accounts that we're really focusing on: PMTF, Common School, Higher Education, and Hathaway. Now, statutorily, Higher Ed and Hathaway cannot invest in equities. So as it stands now, the only 2 reserve accounts that we're focusing on would be Common School and PMTF, Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. From the accounting perspective, because you have to segregate, that would be up to Katie and Dawn and how they do things. But Katie it would probably be better as if they were segregated as opposed to one fund. So each one should have a standalone. You'd have to account for them either way, but you couldn't take money out of the PMTF to satiate demand on Common School. So in that, you would have this fund, but typically it would be separate. Now, the problem that we're saying is for us to get that type of higher return, we can't have a 1.5 year spend, because RBK ran through a Monte Carlo simulation and said, okay, what would be over 500, I think it was 5,000 iterations or whatever. But they said if it was a really bad scenario, like a 3 sigma event, meaning 1 in 100 event.
1929. Or
Correct. Boom, boom, boom. Where you had 3 significant down years in a row. What do you need to bait the basic need? And they said 7 times spend would be wonderful, but you could probably get away with a 5-year spend, meaning 5 years of the spend that we're looking at. And if you had proper tips saying that if you earn more than that, you could actually increase that reserve account over time to get to 7. Then that would fulfill the ability to make us then look at the Common School. I'm just assuming that the State Loan Investment Board and IFC would say, hey, now we have a backfill that will allow us to make sure Common School gets its 5%. And so in that instance, then if we had a 5-year spend, then we could change that allocation to the same allocation that's in the PMTF, and then theoretically get a higher return over time by doing so.
And then, Mr. Chairman, then if you keep those, if there's not a demand to use the reserve account amounts and you've got tips going into them, we hold those. I think what I've seen some of the states do is they keep those there, and then the tip back to the permanent fund is an allocation or something that's legislatively done. We can always add to that, but it's not an automatic tip. It would take it.
And Mr. Chairman, Representative, that's how each state has a different rule and regulation. That would be something that you would look at. Where would you want to tip in? Would you put in? Yeah, there's all kinds of different ways to do this. The one component I do want to mention, which is highlighted in the bill, is for future legislative groups, whether or not they would want to spend this amount of money. So, and that is just many different people have commented, are we better off instead of increasing? So what this bill we're talking about is increasing the reserve accounts towards that 5-year spend, taking it from the LISR is what I'm assuming, and putting it into a reserve account? Or are you better off to take that money, put it into the main funds, into the PMTF and Common School? But that just means the corpus is larger, but it doesn't solve our issue. We still couldn't change asset allocation, or other funds saying, well, why don't you just have the LISRA as a reserve accounts? So, and there's, a million different ways to skin the cat, and all of them have pros and cons. But we were saying, as far as maximizing the return, this would be a better way to do it. I'll just take the backstop to the LISRA. The LISRA, as I said, had those 3 different allocations. It has a lower return than what would be perceived the total rate of return for this reserve accounts would be.
By far.
Depending on your analysis, it should, but the difference is we don't know for sure what the allocation would be in those accounts because you would not be able to have the very illiquid assets in a reserve account. So for instance, private credit, private equity, real estate, those would be three asset classes you would not want to put into
But
a
if you
reserve
use
account.
Lizra is reserve, you know, what almost all have versus even the three categories, the 500 million, the core. I mean, it'd have to be more liquid than it currently is.
Mr. Chairman, we would need to do analysis on that because if on the Craig, we're forecasting 2.9 billion into the 2024 period, and you would say worst case scenario, how much of that would you need? And then you would have to handicap what's the probability of the legislature spending 2.9 over this period. You know, those are things that I cannot quantify.
You look at the goldenrod right now, Lizra is at 1.6. And by the end of this session, it will be 1.5. And our reserve accounts right now are almost $1 billion. So, I mean, they would be at greater risk by being in the Lizra because we tend to use it for other things other than reserve accounts.
Well, that's the other part is what would be perceived more safe would be a reserve account or funds in the Lizra. So for instance, Alaska had $18 billion in their reserve account. Approximately 18. And I believe they spent 15 of it in a year. So those are the things that when the reserve accounts are not protected, that potentially could happen. Now, the other feedback that I've heard is they're saying, oh, well, the Lizra would be more protected in down markets. So for instance, just what we've gone through with this, you know, so I went back to look at our financial year end numbers, and the PMTF over a 1 year period was down 4.5%, but the Lizra was down 6.2. Reason being is the Lizra is not a well-diversified fund. It has those three components. And if you have weakness in the two main securities, which would be equities and fixed income, like we did there, then the Lizra will actually underperform. We'll have worse down periods. So it's not like this Lizra is extremely safe if you have that type of investment outlook. So there's no one right answer to this. All I'm trying to do is to show you the different pros and cons and the money historically that has been lost by not putting this in. And this was all predicated on the IFC and State Loan Investment Board saying, is there some way that we could look at doing this? So a year ago, we met and we were talking about, well, what are some of the things? So we've been working on this saying, well, here's one solution. And we've gone through 2 to 3 CapFin meetings, 2 or 3 sub-CapFin committee meetings to discuss this, different ways to look at it. And this was one of the optimal solutions that would theoretically maximize the return and then allow us to simplify the process, because all of these funds, not all of them, we can't do the Lizra, we can't do workers' compensation, we can't do state agency pool, but the vast majority of all of those other 15 funds would just fall under one asset allocation category, which would be total rate of return.
Well, in reality, workers' comp is really not a whole lot different. It's more similar to a retirement account that properly managed. We could do this in workers' comp.
The workers' comp has a 11.5 year liability. So I do not know what WRS's liability is, but when I first started, we had a 6-year asset versus at that time, it was about a 12.5 year liability, which makes no sense. You want to tenor match those two. And so that's why looking at it, the fixed income portion of what we have is predominantly in long duration bonds to offset that liability. So without looking at WRS, I know they don't have that type of asset allocation. And also the workers' compensation has it's called a PFAD a positive funding requirement. They're not negative. So in the workers' comp ability, we took excess funding and put it into a more higher rate of return asset. So very different. I think WRS might be 80% funded or something. I don't know what, but the workers' comp is overfunded at this period. So that allowed us to take more flexibility.
Okay, can you walk us through the bill?
Yeah, why don't I do that?
Mr. Sackett?
Mr. Chairman, Matt Sagler, State Treasurer's Office, just quickly walk you through the bill. Starting on page 2, what was contemplated, this is redistribution of federal money royalties. It starts there on page 2. The important language there's on page 3, and then honestly the meat of it is on page 4 at the top. This redistributes FMR money that would go to the school foundation program, so on line 6, amounts which would otherwise be distributed to the school foundation program, etc., shall be deposited into the LSRA. So this repays the LSRA with money that would go to the school foundation program, that $359 million that we are taking from the LSRA to deposit into the common school reserve account. So this is repaying that $359,100,000.
I have 359. Mine says 459. On page 3?
Page 4
I'm sorry.
on the top.
I see it. Okay.
So
go
this is
back- go back and walk us a little bit more in detail. What? Tell us. I mean, we need to know what 94601 is.
So that's the federal mineral royalty distribution statute. So, and on page 3, it says
So the only
several
addi-
places,
Yeah, the only addition is this subsection. And this,
subsection O
Okay.
several times, which
And
is
O.
then on page 4.
yeah, I'm with you.
And that moves the distribution from the school foundation program for FMRs to the LSRA, because later in the bill, we're transferring that $359 million from the LSRA to the common school reserve account. So this is a mechanism to repay the LSRA with the FMRs for the common school portion of this.
So the
Mr. Chair.
359 are all FMRs.
This repayment to the LSRA is all FMRs.
But then where does the 359 come from? Where does it start? Is it common school program dollars, or is it FMRs that would, or is it a swap?
So later in the bill, we transfer $359 million from the LSRA to the common school permanent reserve account. This language then takes federal mineral royalties that are coming in on mineral, from federal mineral
On school lands?
on school lands, et cetera. That money would go to SFP. This takes that money and moves it to the LSRA.
What
Mr.
I
Chairman.
want to clarify is that my understanding is that when the governor transferred 248 million to the common schools permanent fund, he used that figure because that was the maximum amount of FMRs available to transfer from the common schools revenues. And so this is 100 million more than that. So where does that other 100 million come from?
Well, this would be over time until that amount is reached. I don't remember exactly what the estimate is in the, so it looks like, yeah, the fiscal note shows in FY24 that 248 million would go to the LSRA and not go into the school foundation program. And the next year would be the remaining 111 million.
Mr. Chairman.
So that would continue on until the 359 is met.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it is just a swap, is how I envision it, to effectuate this, to make sure the right funds that can be going to the right places happen. But I think the 359, and please clarify, is what it takes to fill the reserve account to get to that 5X
5X. yeah.
that we're talking about. That's how the 359 number was derived.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, that's correct.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
And so to recap this, the federal mineral royalties that flow into the LSRA are all of the federal mineral royalties that are received that are above the so-called second cap of $429 million. Is that right?
Everything that would go to the school foundation program, yeah.
Well, just to follow up. So in the $429 million, the reason that number is there is because that was the estimated amount that Craig estimated in the January 2022, Craig, as how much it would be. Now we think there's going to be more than 429, and that's why we can sweep off the extra. Is that the idea?
Mr. Chairman, correct.
Say that again.
So, Mr. Chairman, the reason it's $429 million and not some other number on page 3 is because $429 million was the amount of expected federal mineral royalties based upon the January 2022 consensus revenue estimating group report. Things have improved since then. We expect to have more money, and that's why you can do it. But my follow-up question is, above this second cap, it's my recollection that not all of the money above the FMRs above the second cap go to the school foundation program, but it's some split between the school foundation program and the general fund or the budget reserve account. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, well, I'm no longer with LSO, so I'm not an expert on all of those FMR tips. Yes, there is a split, but I don't remember exactly what that is. School foundation program and the BRA.
And bra is the split. And so I want to clarify when the January Craig came out, the reserve accounts, because of the long-term profile, went down. So there was requiring the amount in the reserve accounts to need to be increased at that point in time, correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
But we had this discussion and we decided to go with the October Craig monies. And I brought that amendment mainly because there was the increase was like 170 million. And the thought was we're going to have a hard enough time getting the lower amount, let alone the new calculated 5 times X. And so does this have the January Craig or does this have the October Craig in it?
Mr. Chairman, this is the October numbers.
Yeah, that's
640-ish.
Now we have the opportunity, I think, through a budget amendment, and we could do it in the budget bill, or we could do it in this bill at some point to increase it because of the significant reserve or extra revenues we now have in the common school program account, 800 and some odd million, and our next biennium has another 700 or 800 million forecasted. And we have, because this goes back to the budget bill where some of the transfers for SIPA, major maintenance, and those, I think we came up with a roughly 200 million, 240 million that we can swap out with other dollars that come from that $812 million excess, and then use those monies to increase this account. So we can get to the new 5X and maybe even more. And we could definitely, but next year, the next cycle, when we do this, the next budget, move it up to 7X or 9X, because we're going to have that excess revenues and we'll be able to get there, at least on the common school side. Just so you know what we're kind of thinking or contemplating. That makes sense? Go ahead, Patrick.
The other thing that I want to comment on that shortfall is it's really, it was predicated on 2 different things. Is our managers went down in dividend payments because, once again, this definition of income. So because of the uncertainty in the market, They went to more high quality equities that typically have a lower dividend payment. So that hit the dividend projection that we had. And then on the income projection, if you buy a bond, which we have a lot of bonds that we bought years ago that, let's just say, had a 0.25% coupon, and you know that you're going to get par 100 at maturity, but we only get a quarter. So a quarter, and then you get par 100 at maturity. Versus now we could buy a 3.5% bond and we'd get 3.5 in par. The difference with the lower coupons is the price of those bonds are now at 90. So we're going to get a big, when they mature, you're going to get an uptick from 90 to 100. So that lost money, not all of it's lost. It's just, if we had an accrual method of counting and you looked at if assuming this bond is not going to default, you would then get that money over that time. But now we're only getting a coupon amount until we get the difference between the current price and par. So this is really getting into the woods, but getting back to what you're saying, a lot of this money that we had will be coming back later on. We just don't know when from our managers. And, you know, the same thing, any of the bonds that we had personally bought years ago that had this low coupon, they're going to have a much lower interest than current just because of what we get paid. But we know we're going to get that money back when the bond matures. So that hopefully goes back to your saying or your thought that we should get a lot of this money back in future allocations, but we just can't forecast when.
Which justifies not using January, correct?
Correct. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I should have reiterated. That would be one instance why we could use the October one.
Fascinating. Okay. All right. On page 4, back to page 4.
So, Mr. Chairman, page 4, bottom of the page deals with the permanent trust fund, and starting on line 22 over onto page 5, top of the page, this language is inserted to explain that the reserve account created by this subsection is intended to be inviolate and constitute a permanent or perpetual trust. So you'll see this language repeated through the other accounts as well. This is to note that the reserve accounts are intended to be inviolate. Of course, it's not constitutional, so it's giving an indication that these shall not be spent.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, we could say they shall be inviolate. And
Correct, Mr. Chairman.
it's like for better or for worse. Yeah, I see that. Okay, go ahead.
And the bottom of page 5 on line 19, that changes the percent cap. As has been discussed before, the appropriation is for a 5 times spend, but this change in the language is to accommodate a 7 times spend. So this changes the amount that would tip from the reserve account to the corpus. So Representative Larson talked about that mechanism and other states. What this statute does here on line 19, page 5, is creates a 7 times spend. So when the reserve account reached 7 times the spending policy amount, that amount would over the cap would then tip into the corpus. And you'll see that repeated through the bill on the other accounts.
So they're all created to prevent the tip until they're at 7 times.
Correct, Mr. Chairman. Moving on to page 6, the middle of the page there, starting on line 5, line 6 is the common school. Same language as we just looked at for the PMTF on the inviolate nature of the common school account. Permanent perpetual trust, the bottom of the page is that same cap increase to a 7 times spend for the common school account from 150% to that 420%.
So it would be helpful, Matt, to have like a little 1-page bullet point that has each account and the numbers and the percentages. So that we have, and the amounts of you we're talking about. So we have that handy and we understand the numbers and the figures when we ask questions about.
Sure, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
So on the bottom of page 5, the line you were just explaining about the account to be up to 245% of the spending policy amount. Is the reason that creates a 5 times spend is because the guarantee by the reserve account isn't the full 5% spending policy amount, but the guarantee is only 3.75%. Is that why the number's not 500%? Because normally I would think, if it's 5 times, it should be 500%, not 245.
Well, and there's already, it's taking the current balance of the fund as well.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stith, correct. The bigger impact though is to guarantee the 5%. We're assuming about a 2% yield. So those income dividends, we're assuming about a 2% built into every year's return. So we don't need the full 5% to cover it. And maybe Patrick can explain. Just something like that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Stiff. So we went back in the Craig and just looked at no matter what, in good periods, bad periods, whatever, our definition of income, what was the lowest amount of income that we produced? And it was slightly above 2%. So what we're saying is no matter what structure that we have, we will be able to produce at least 2% in income. And if we have a 5% spend, then we only have to make up the 3. So the additional monies that we're talking about to come into the common school and the PMTF is only making up that difference between the 2 and the 5, or the 2 3/4. That's where that money comes from.
Mr. Chairman, I guess what I'm confused about is that the guarantee, at least with respect to the permanent mineral trust fund reserve account, it doesn't guarantee the full 5%. It only guarantees 3.75%, right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, that is correct. That is the numbers in the allocations that we're looking at, is to fulfill that 375 for the PMTF and 5 for common school.
Mr. Chairman, which is why the increase to the PMTF reserve account isn't as large as we would need for the common school, because we're really only covering, that 1.75% that isn't guaranteed, where in the common school reserve account, we are covering that 3% guarantee, that the gap between what we know in income and the 5% spend. That makes sense.
Okay, go ahead.
So we covered page 6, which is the common school. Page 7 is the higher education account, has again that same language on the inviolate nature and a permanent perpetual trust.
So that's why that's 400% versus the 240, right? That's what we just talked about.
Yep. And on line 16, line 17 on page 7, there is the increase to the reserve, to the tip for the higher ed account as well. Moving on to page 8 is a deletion of the language that is basically discusses the loan loss reserves, which goes on to page 9. Bottom of page 9 is the Hathaway account language, which again has the inviolate and constitute permanent perpetual trust language.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead.
going back to the bottom of page 8, we're deleting the loan loss reserve account. And why are we doing that? Was it not used, not needed?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Walters, generally, I think it is not used. Edie is here. She may be able to expand upon that more.
Is it part of this process, or are we just doing something a little extra? Or are we simplifying?
Good morning, Katie Smith. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the State Treasurer's Office. Mr. Chairman, I believe it's just to simplify the process and eliminate some of those transfers from the reserve. It has been used, but it's not a large amount that is being transferred. So I think it's just to simplify the process.
When you say it has been used,
We have been making transfers, Mr. Chairman.
will it still be needed with our reserve accounts?
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe so.
What, I mean, if the loan loss reserve account is needed for some reason, how are we going to fix that particular reason under the new simplification? So how do we describe it to the floor?
Mr. Chairman, I agree. I am not entirely sure why it was extracted from. I believe it's just for simplicity purposes.
Go ahead. Don?
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'm Dawn Williams, Deputy State Treasurer. I believe that, so in the event that there was a need to cover a loss, that the language stops right where it says that we would be required to come to the legislature to request
Restore
an
the balance.
appropriation for that specific purpose. I believe the reason this section was struck is because we're trying to limit transfers from that reserve account. We're trying to make that, the idea is to make that as an inviolate account. So that would be to limit the transfers that would be able to come out of it so that you could more properly manage that reserve account. It's limited to those, the spending policy, and that's it. So I believe that's why that's.
So another way to say it is, we took this out so that this loss component is not automatic. And that way we know about it and we're informed up by it, and then we are instructed by you and we say, okay, take this much amount to fix it
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
and take it out of the reserve account essentially.
Well, Mr. Chairman, or wherever.
Or
you
whenever, you could use other dollars if you choose to.
Yeah.
That makes sense? So, but my only question is, by striking it, are we making the bill more complicated for us to present versus, even though it's simplifying things?
Mr. Chairman, I suppose that you would be the one to make that determination, but the idea again is if you were to be explaining that the inviolate nature of this account, you want to limit the amount of transfers that can be automatically appropriated from that account to preserve the balance.
But the purpose of the reserve account is by definition is to help preserve that fund, to keep the fund balance up, right? So is this just an appropriation from the reserve accounts, or is it from the permanent? It wouldn't be the permanent accounts, so it'd be the reserve.
Mr. Chairman, trying to take a guess at what the goal was here. I think the goal was if this automatically on a quarterly basis made a transfer from the reserve account to the loan loss reserve account is my understanding. And if we want to have the reserve account treated as inviolate, we would not want to have this automatic transfer take place. Rather, to address a loan loss scenario, we would rather the treasurer's office come to the legislature and ask us to make a direct deposit back into the PMTF to make up for any loan losses.
Or, I mean, we could do it over 3 years theoretically to figure out the best way to do it without the minimum impact to the bottom line. I mean, lots of different options as opposed to an automatic one. Because if it's automatic, I would think you would want to have a little more liquidity in your cash. Right? You got to tell us if we're talking up the wrong tree or not.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're exactly correct. That's another good reason not to make this transfer
Yeah.
quarterly, because we would like to shift our ability to invest those reserve accounts into that total return strategy, which is a more liquid versus cash.
Okay. That's why we keep doing this.
So back bottom of page 9 is the Hathaway language. On the inviolate nature, page 10. Middle of the page, Hathaway is a little different. It has a number tip as well as a percentage tip. This was probably a creation of when the Hathaway was first created. It was a $12 million tip. And then as that account grew, as the money was flowing in, there was also a 4.5%. So this ups both those numbers to a seven times spend, so 47 million, or an 8%. So as time goes on, the 8% would, carry the number. And so then on bottom of page 10 is this beginning of section 2, which are the transfers. Moving on to page 11, those are the transfers from the LSRA. You see there starting on line 5 is the 359,100,000 to the common school permanent reserve account from the LSRA. Line 11 is the 274.7 million from the LSRA to the permanent mental trust fund reserve account. Line 17 is 4.6 million from the LSRA to the Hathaway Student Scholarship Reserve account. On to page 12 is line 1 is $1.2 million from the LSRA to the Higher Education Reserve account. So those are the 4, transfers to the reserve accounts to get them to the 5 times spend. The funding is for 5 times based on the October, Craig, as we had discussed, yeah. But then the tip numbers within the bill are the 7 times spend. So starting on section B, basically says we can't invest those. Starting with B in the next couple subsections says that those will be deposited, but we can't invest in a way inconsistent with our reserve accounts until state treasurer's office certifies to the Office of State Lands that the back office, and we're prepared and ready to do it and can do this effectively. That's the language in 1, starting there on 14 and on to page 13 with sub-Romanet 2 that basically says the SLIB will certify to us that we've told them that we're capable of doing this. I don't know if you guys have questions on that, but basically we have to go in front of the SLIB to tell them that our back office and operations is ready to accommodate these funds and invest within the total return, strategy with these reserve accounts. Section 3 in the middle of bottom page of 13 is an addition that says the Department of Education shall not request. There was $533,000 that Department of Ed used from Hathaway to pay for some of their administrative program. I don't know a whole lot about that, but this says that they shall not ask for that in the next biennium. And then the rest of the bill is the legislative findings, starting section 4, basically starting at the top of page 14 is the legislative findings that you guys have installed in there. And then the bill is effective July 1 of 23.
So the legislative findings in section 4. Why is it at the end of the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know. That would be, I guess, the Legislative Service Office's drafting of the bill. I think some of the other bills I've seen findings recently at the end as well, but I don't know if there's a purpose for that or not.
Did they come ask us?
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
I think the reason, and I could be wrong, is if they're at the back of the bill, it means that they will go in session law, but not in the green books. If they're in the front of the bill, they'll go in the green books.
One of them did.
And I could be backwards on that.
You might be right, but let's just find out about that. Okay, it's 10:02. We might call you back either after lunch or this evening to work through this a little bit more. I think we need to have some more discussions on this before we kick this thing out.
Mr. Chairman, we're not scheduled at noon. You know, you've got the skill games thing too, and we want to come back at noon and visit on this and the skill games, finish those up.
Well, I think we can do the skill games right now. We'll just miss roll call and shaking hands. So we'll kick it out, at least get the latest and the greatest.
Okay.
So, Patrick, I'll let you guys know. Any issue, or maybe on adjournment.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, no sneaking. Okay, quickly, come on up. And that's the let's see. Catherine. You have any new emails or updates? What? Oh, just go ahead. Remind us of where we're at.
So, Mr. Chairman, Catherine Wilkinson here today on behalf of Cowboy Skill and Peace-O-Matic. Where we are at, Mr. Chairman, you had asked us to email you a couple of proposed amendments. We did sit down with the Gaming Commission, so I don't know if they wanted to walk through them. And then in conversations after with some other members, there was a second amendment developed. So there are two amendments before you. The proposed amendment number 1, which was requested by you, Chairman Nicholas, to address the licensing amount of the fee, to changing it for the manufacturer fee from $10,000 down to $5,000 with a renewal fee of $2,500. The second amendment, proposed amendment, Mr. Chairman, was a request of a combination license for putting in the missing piece of distributor. Vendor is already in statute, but I thought you may want to see the definition for it. Distributor is the one that passes out the skill games after receiving them from the manufacturer. And it was, the intent of this was to make a combination license so that if you are serving in all 3 roles, that you would not pay more than a total of $5,000 in fees.
Mr. Chairman, I thought you was gonna, so I don't see a fee, I don't see a licensing fee for distributor.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize that I didn't get that language in there. The original language from 4 years ago for a licensing fee, I believe was in that 25. I think it was actually 5,000 amount with 2,500 renewal.
Comments? From anybody? Come on, Terry.
Good morning, Chairman Nicholas, members of the committee. I'm Terry Armitage. I'm with the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police. We speak in support of this bill because this is a gambling operation. Like many others we have in Wyoming, close regulations necessary. So licensing all of the key people involved is crucial. Excuse me, is crucial. The oversight of the gambling operations in the state. As far as the proposed amendments, we don't have a dog in that fight. The amount that you charge for fees, that's up to the committee and the legislature ultimately. But with that, I'd stand for questions.
Okay, any questions for Terry? Thank you, Terry. Appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
What's your name?
Mr. Chairman, Nick Agopian, representing Bank Shot LLC. We're okay with the language here as long as we believe that it covers my clients to be dual or triple licensed if necessary. But I sit here to correct the word gambling. Gambling is illegal in this state. Skills games are. And once they're approved by the Gaming Commission, that puts it to bed. This is not gambling. That is illegal in this state. Thank you.
Okay, does everyone understand the amendment? We have a consensus. We have a motion.
Move the bill, do pass.
If we do pass, discussion,
With this amendment.
is there amendments? Representative Stitt? Or Representative Walters, either one.
Mr. Chairman, I would move proposed amendment number 2 that was presented to us. And then I would add a couple things to it under the distributor definition that they would be charged $5,000 initial with a $2,500 renewal.
So that would go down to that line.
And then at the bottom of this proposed amendment, the licensee acting in the vendor, distributor, manufacturer shall not pay more than $5,000 in initial fees or $3,000 in renewal fees. That's what I would put in there, because it's not clear if that 5,000 is forever and ever, or what that number really relates back to.
That makes sense?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, that motion carries. And Ron, would you work with
I'll work with
Jackie to make sure we got the like language? Any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Stitt?
I would move on page 3, line 17, to delete the words possession or. I believe we had this discussion in December.
Say that again, Clark, please.
Page 3, line 17. Delete the phrase possession or, so that it limits the licensing to an employee of a vendor who's directly involved in the distribution, as opposed to someone in mere possession. I think we had that discussion in December about not wanting to have it be overly broad. Kind of forgotten the details of that discussion, but I didn't want this to be licensing more people than necessary.
Does anyone else have comments? Second. Move for discussion. Go ahead, Kathy.
Mr. Chairman, I still think it's a little bit vague, this concept just in general of employee licensor. So if you're going to have distributor definition, which was just adopted in that amendment, then that's mixing up. So distribution would actually be the distributor's job. So these are employee of the vendors. It's that subclass of licensing of a vendor that you're discussing. So I think that it makes the adoption of the previous makes this unclear.
A physical act of distributing a machine rather than being a distributor.
It's not the title of the person, it's the action which he's engaged in.
Mr. Chairman, and I would agree with that, but distribution of them, I don't know if that covers exactly what you're trying to cover it with the
So
possession.
Delivery, fix that. Delivery versus distribution.
I think, Mr. Chairman, perhaps even maintenance.
Mr. Chairman, again, Nick Agopian. I would offer a comment to what we heard from Director Moore. Individuals that have access to the internal workings of the machine
Is what he's concerned about.
is where that concern was. I may differ from my peers on the value of doing that. I certainly respect and understand that, but for our position, that's where we're at. Yeah.
Mr.
directly
Chairman,
involved.
it's covered with directly involved in the previous definition. So I
don't think we need to tinker with this particular one.
I withdraw the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw the second. Hey, on page 3, I would just like to delete line 16 through 19. Just take the whole thing out. So there is no $50 fee.
Second.
Discussion.
Why?
It appears that anybody that even comes and touches has to go through the $50 fee is for security purposes. And it just seems like if we have to go and run security checks on anybody and everybody that walks in there is just a little onerous.
Mr. Chairman, I'd also add that the only folks that this really protects is the business owner. And I don't mean to sound rude, but we don't care about the business owner because the state will still be made whole. The business owner would be the only one that would be left at a disadvantage by worrying about the employees. The employees work for the business owner, and the business owner is the one who is at the largest risk of losing their license if the employee does something wrong. So this is really an employee-employer relationship, and the Gaming Commission should stay out of it. So I strongly second this amendment.
Okay, further discussion. All those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no? No. All those in favor, raise their hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. That passes. So we'll need to renumber. Okay, and so once again, Tom, will you work with Jackie on that? Any other amendments? Seeing the question on the bill, roll call.
Representative Henderson. Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Sherwood. Representative Stith.
Aye.
Representative Walters. Representative Swanitzer.
No.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye. Okay, for that vote, Mr. Wood. Tom, you get to put this. Okay, I think we're late.